Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We are now going into week 9 of our preparation. 7 was the quiz. 8 last week, you talked about social psychology. And this week, in week number 9, we're going to be talking about developmental psychology, also known as lifespan. That's what it mostly is referred to now. Lifespan psychology or developmental can be defined as biological, emotional, cognitive, and social development across the lifespan, right? From infancy into late adulthood. So it really is, we used to look at just child development, but now we realize that development is dynamic. It carries on from stage to stage to stage. And really, we don't stop developing at any point in our history. So that's why it's so important. So let's talk about some of the basic concepts that you're going to see in developmental or lifespan psychology. We talk about issues of nature versus nurture a lot in this section. Nature refers to your heredity, your biological makeup, and how that influences your personality development, right? How you develop as a person. That's one thing. The other thing is the nurture, right? Nurture is your environment. The environment that you grow up in as a child and continue to develop in as an adult, how much influence does that have in the development of your personality? Well, most psychologists agree that nature and nurture interact with each other to influence our development. The difference comes in what some psychologists believe that nature is far more important, that it's 80% of the formula and 20% is nurture. And then some psychologists believe the exact opposite. Some psychologists believe, like the behaviorists, like Skinner, believe that most of our personalities develop from our nurture or our environment and not from our nature. The generalized agreement now that you find within lifespan or developmental psychology is that there are a lot of things that are predisposed by your heredity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to develop those issues. It may depend on how your environment affects. So there's some interaction. It's just a matter of how much influence genetics has. And it turns out that genetic predisposition, that's a key term, right? That means the propensity to develop something, is pretty influential in certain areas. We know that, for instance, your propensity to develop a certain type of mental illness is genetically imprinted in you, right? So doesn't mean that you're going to become a schizophrenic if you have a schizophrenic parent, but your percentages of becoming schizophrenic are higher than in the general population, right? Same thing with something like alcoholism. If you have one parent that's an alcoholic, then you are about 25% more likely than the general population to develop alcoholism. If you have two alcoholic parents, you're about 50% more likely than the general population, and maybe even a little more than that. But remember that if you have knowledge that your parents or a parent are alcoholics, you can always stop that propensity by not drinking any alcohol, and then you wouldn't become an alcoholic. So again, that's genetic predisposition. So, as I said, Skinner believed very much in the environment, and we'll talk about other theorists that believe much more in the genetic makeup in order for the influence on our development. I want to just give you a brief synopsis of the type of studies that we see within the field of developmental psychology or lifespan. Right, so we do see the case study on occasion, like what I asked you to do for your presentation. Case study is a good way of getting in-depth information about an individual case, but it's not particularly good at gaining a reputation for replication and reliability, because it usually involves something that's very specific to that case, right? So it's very hard to take the methodology that you use in a case study and generalize that to data that covers the general population, right? So case studies are sometimes used, especially if you initiate them to get an idea, but generally speaking, not a particularly popular way of doing research in this area. Second type of research is a longitudinal study. Longitudinal study basically means that you study the same individuals at different points in time on this very similar questions that you're going to be asking. It is a difficult way to study with humans, and part of the reason for that is because it's a long-term type of study. People could move, they could lose interest in the study. Maybe they're not available for some reason, and so what happens is sometimes you lose subjects over time. And the other reason that it's very difficult is because a lot of times a longitudinal study takes a much longer period of time. Let's say you wanted to study language development, right? Vocabulary development. And you started by saying, I'm going to look at someone who's 3 years old, 5 years old, 7 years old, 9 years old, right? So different age levels. And so in theory, if you started at 3 and you ended the study at age 9 for language development, it would take you 6 years to do that study. Now, that's a pretty long period of time in research years. Some longitudinal studies are even longer than that. There's a well-known breastfeeding study that went on for 20 years. And so you certainly can do it. It's a very thorough way of doing research, and many times that's a very valuable way of doing it. However, one of the problems with longitudinal study is it's costly, right? It's costly because the study goes on for a long time, and because you may have to use resources to track information down, and it takes a long time to keep records going for a period of 6 years, 10 years, 20 years. That's a very costly way of doing research. It is thorough. It does help us to follow the same set of people, so there's a lot of validity within the study, but it is very costly and time-consuming. So, what's our alternative? Well, the last technique that I wanted to tell you about was a cross-sectional study. A cross-sectional study is most of what developmental research is, and you'll see why in a second, but for the most part what it means is it's more efficient, right? So what you do is you compare samples of kids at the different age levels on the same issue, right? So instead, let's go back to our study on vocabulary development. Let's say you wanted to do a study on vocabulary development from ages 3 through age 9 using every 2-year intervals, right? So if you wanted to do that now, and you do it in a cross-sectional way instead of longitudinal, now all you do is you take a group of 33-year-olds, you take a group of 35-year-olds, a group of 7-year-olds, 37-year-olds, and a group of 39-year-olds, right? And you do testing across the board, and you get your results, and you're able to do a comparison. Now, a study like that might take you 6 months to do, as opposed to the original proposed study, which was longitudinal, taking you 6 years. Now, why don't we just do all studies like that? Well, there are some problems with cross-sectional too. The advantage is that it's quicker and more easily done, much more cost efficient, and that's a good thing. The disadvantage is it doesn't really tell how stable people's characteristics are because it compares different people. So for instance, the 3-year-olds of today may be learning vocabulary in a more efficient way than the 3-year-olds of 6 years ago, right? Are there more kids in preschool? Are there more computer programs that help teach vocabulary at age 3? What are the factors involved for this particular 3-year-old as opposed to when the 9-year-old was a 3-year-old, right? So it's not quite as thorough, it's not quite as complete as your longitudinal study, but many, many studies are done this way because it is far more efficient. I also want to mention that many times what you'll see is that when you get a study that's done either longitudinally or a study that's done cross-sectionally, sometimes the researcher will go and do the study using the opposite technology just to prove that the results would be the same. So that's a kind of a common thing that happens also. Okay, so next we're going to look at the prenatal period, because that's going to be very important. The prenatal period starts obviously with impregnation and then goes on through birth, and then after that we'll look at some capabilities. So talking about the prenatal period, we divide it into 3 different stages from conception to birth. That lasts approximately 9 months. And these 3 stages are the germinal stage, the embryonic stage, and the fetal stage. Now, first we have conception, right? Conception occurs if one of the sperm penetrate the egg, egg's outer membrane, and once the egg is fertilized, it's called a zygote. This is going to be important that that's called a zygote. It then begins to multiply, and after a couple of weeks, it attaches itself into the wall of the uterus. Now, this is a very important thing, right? Implantation into the wall of the uterus actually begins the embryonic stage. Excuse me. That's very important because that stage of attaching to the uterus is sometimes overlooked as a cause of infertility, right? So even if you have an egg that's fertilized, if it doesn't attach, it can't gain the nourishment it needs to continue to survive. So that's why that's a very important aspect. The embryonic stage is the second stage, runs from 2 weeks to 8 weeks following conception, right? During that time, you get a lot of cell division, and you begin to differentiate into bone and muscle and body organs. So that's really important. The fetal stage is the third stage and begins 2 months after conception. That lasts until birth. The lungs and the vital organs have to be fully developed during that time. The last organ to be developed? Yes, it's the lungs. The first one? The heart, of course, because you can hear the heartbeat, right? So during stages 2 and 3, the fetus is especially vulnerable to toxic agents and chemicals, right? The blood supply to the fetus is somewhat protected by the placenta. Placenta is an organ that's supposed to filter the blood, make sure that only things that are good go into the fetus. The blood is interacting between the mother and the fetus during this time, right? So it does act as a filter. But certain things, unfortunately, can penetrate that, right? And so we find that the fetus can be vulnerable to certain things. Anything that can potentially harm a developing fetus and can cause deformities or brain damage or any type of damage, that's called a teratogen. You'll see it in the book, right? Teratogens, anything that can cause, any agent that can cause harm. So there's a lot of things that can potentially cause harm to the fetus, unfortunately. You can talk about things like drugs causing damage, which include nicotine, caffeine, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, alcohol. Any of those things can potentially cause danger to the developing fetus. Viruses, including HIV and genital herpes, the Zika virus, I'm sure you heard of, those things also can affect the fetus. They are teratogens. Environmental agents such as cleaning fluids, acids, and lead can also potentially affect the developing fetus. So those things are all potentially harmful, so you have to be very much aware of it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the teratogens that I just mentioned. Right, we know a lot about things like cocaine use and the effect. I unfortunately had to work with babies that were born addicted to crack cocaine, and they go through withdrawal from cocaine because the mother is addicted at the time of birth. And that affects them quite profoundly. It affects their cognitive functioning. They have a lot of behavior problems. There's a lot of potential issues with children who are born addicted to cocaine or any other substance for that matter. Smoking. We know that nicotine leads to decreased birth weight, increases premature birth, increases ADHD, and increases sudden infant death syndrome. So there's a lot of studies that indicate that smoking can be very harmful to the developing fetus, right? Air pollution, X-rays, all these things could potentially have poor effects. Alcohol. We know that heavy drinking can lead to fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS. Fetal alcohol syndrome results from drinking, but we don't know exactly how much. That's why it's recommended now by doctors that you don't do any drinking, because for different women, it could be a different amount of drinking that can affect the fetus, right? When a child has a fetal alcohol syndrome, they have physical problems, they're shorter, they have a flattened nose, they have psychological problems such as oftentimes mental retardation, behavior problems, hyperactivity. So, of course, fetal alcohol syndrome can be prevented just by not drinking, especially during pregnancy, right? So, those are some of the things that could potentially have an effect on the developing fetus. Let's talk about some skills that the infant has when they're born, first born. If they're born sort of with a normal type of formation, they are given something called an APGAR test. So the APGAR score that the infant gets is a measure of 5 different things to show what the health of the baby is. And those 5 things are skin color, heart rate, reflexes, activity or muscle tone, and respiration or breathing. So those are the aspects that are measured, and for each aspect you get a score of either 0, 1, or 2, and then you add them up, 10 being the best score, 8 or 9 being okay, good, and then below that you start to get some concern, right? So that's the APGAR score. So that's upon birth. So I want to talk about some of the reflexes that we note in the neonate, the newborn, right? Neonate is defined as anything 4 weeks post-birth, right? And they're born with a lot of reflexes so they can respond to the world, right? So a couple of the reflexes I want to mention, I mean, anything that accompanies a behavior at that age could potentially be a reflex, like breathing's a reflex, blinking's a reflex, coughing, sneezing, vomiting are all reflexes, right? But I want you to be aware of a couple of important ones. The Babinski reflex is the one on the bottom of the foot that when the bottom of the foot is rubbed, it raises the toes and makes them curl out and in, right? That's Babinski. That doctors often look for sensitivity in that area. The Moro reflex, when support is removed from the back of the head, right? If they're not supported properly, that generates a baby going back. They kind of get startled. They usually don't like it. They go back. Their hands are out in an outward motion, and then they reach forward in a hugging motion, right? So that's what we call the Moro reflex. Probably a survivor reflex. Hang on to something because I feel as if I'm not being properly supported. And then there are the food intake reflexes. Those are very important reflexes that the neonate has, right? So I wanted to mention these. And there's a series of 3 of them that are all connected. First one is rooting. Rooting means that you get touched on the side of the cheek and you turn toward that touch, right? You turn toward wherever the orientation to that touch is, you turn toward it. I probably turned the wrong way there. But wherever the source of the touch is, you turn toward that touch. That's called rooting, and that helps the baby to actually locate the source of nourishment, right? The second in the sequence is the sucking reflex. The infant doesn't have to be taught to suck. When they're introduced into the breast of the bottle, they automatically begin to suck. In fact, if you stick your finger anywhere near an infant's mouth, that will turn on the sucking reflex too, right? And it's very powerful. And the third reflex is the swallow reflex. So when you take the nourishment in, you got to bring it down into the stomach in order to get the nourishment from it. So that's the swallowing reflex. And those are all reflexive behaviors related to food intake, right? So those are examples of some of the reflexes that we want to talk about. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the ability for the infant, the newborn, to perceive things, right? So they are able to hear when they come. Actually, they're able to hear in utero. That's why it does make sense to play music to the stomach, because babies do hear in utero. It's a little muffled. But we know that 1-month-old infants have very keen hearing and can distinguish different sounds very readily at even 1 month. So their hearing is pretty good when they're born, and it keeps getting progressively better. We know that by 6 months, infants can make all of the sounds necessary to learn their native language, right? Which is very important because that's how it's so much easier when you're younger to start picking up the sounds of your language. That's when people ask about bilingual homes and they say, well, is it going to confuse the child? And the answer is no, because it's easier for a young child to incorporate the rules of different languages than it is for adults who have set ways of kind of looking at language development. Touch. Newborns have a very well developed sense of touch. Again, they can feel in utero and will instinctually turn their head when touched on the cheek. Again, that's the rooting I talked about, right? That's an instinct. Touch also initiates the grasping reflex. Now, if you've ever put your fingers into the palms of a newborn, they initiate that very strong grasping reflex, very powerful, and they can actually pull themselves up using your fingers if you initiate the grasping reflex, right? So that's the type of thing that we want to talk about. Those are very important things that the infant is born with. What about smell and taste? Well, we know that a 1-day-old infant can discriminate a lot of different odors. We know a 6-week-old infant are able to smell the difference between the mother and any stranger. Newborns have an inborn preference for sweet and salt, and they have a dislike for bitter and sour. Now, why does that make sense? Well, think about it. What type of things that the infant could put in their mouth are bitter and sour? Those tend to be more poisonous or things that are not good for them, right? So, poo, they spit it out. And they have a preference for sweet and salty things, which tend to be things that are going to help to nourish them. What about depth perception? Depth perception. So, by the age of 6 months, we know that most infants develop depth perception. That is, they can tell the distance between things. They can tell that when they go up to a staircase, if they're not careful, they're going to go over the edge and tumble down. And so this is very important. This was discovered in a very classic experiment called the visual cliff, developed by Gibson and Walk in 1960. If you look at YouTube, you will find a video that refers you to the original visual cliff experiment by Gibson and Walk. And what you'll see is that they made sort of an invisible cliff. So it looked like a young infant that was around 6 months of age was going to crawl over, and it looked to that infant like there was a drop-off. There was a plexiglass over the cliff. Right? And so the infant would crawl right up to the edge of the plexiglass, but would not go over the plexiglass, fearing that they would tumble over. And that's how we know that they had depth perception. They found in that experiment that most of the infants that were asked to crawl over to their mother over the visual cliff would not do it. But if they were called over to the other side where it didn't appear that there was a drop-off, then the infants most of the time would crawl over to the mother. So that was a very important experiment. As I said, it's called the visual cliff. Look that one up. Some of the abilities are inborn, but environmental stimulation through touch and play is going to encourage the development of sensory abilities. This was found by Collins in the year 2000. What we know is that, excuse me, that you are certain things are inborn, certain things are there for the idea of development, so that if you enhance the environment and you stimulate the child as they're developing, we know that it does help them to develop better skills, and so it's very, very important to stimulate their environment from a very young age all the way up through childhood. Another thing I wanted to mention was temperament. One of the things that we know through studies is that temperament is a relatively stable, long-lasting individual difference in mood and emotional behavior. It emerges clearly in early childhood and tends to be influenced, we think, by genetic factors, right, the temperament, and it tends to remain pretty stable throughout the child's life. You can find babies that are easy babies as one category of temperament. You can find slow to warm up babies. You can find difficult babies. And then some babies don't fit into any distinctive category, one category. But we do know that Temperament seems to develop by age 2 to 3 months, and largely it's due to genetic factors. Bates found that in the 2000 study. Right? There can be some moderate changes in temperament due to the environment, but that tends to stay relatively stable throughout the person's life. One other thing I want to note is the importance of attachment, right? When we look at studies that have been done by Freud, by Skinner, by Sternberg, all of these folks, the attachment is such a important fundamental emotional bond that develops between the infant and the parents or the caregiver. The process begins right after birth and continues all the way throughout early childhood. What we know is that close attachments are important for the development of future issues of personality, such as relationships. It allows for trust or creates distrust in future relationship setups, right? So the problem is that close attachments are very, very important early on, right? When Freud proposed this back in the late 1800s, he was laughed at. How dare he say that behavior that occurs or issues that occur at age 1 or 2 when we can't even consciously remember it affect relationships much later on in adulthood? Well, it turned out it was true, right? When people suffered from poor attachment behavior with their caregiver, their parents, and felt unloved, so to speak, they did develop mistrust in future relationships. That was a very important finding, that what happens in early childhood does affect adult behavior later on. Interesting. I want to talk to you a little bit about some very important people that did some studies in this area of developmental research. One of them is Jean Piaget. Piaget was a Swiss developmental psychologist, and he thought that knowledge was a form of adaptation to the child's present environment. He studied children in a very different way. He would sit with them and play with them, and he noted that children were constantly adapting to their situations, right? And so he proposed two main processes by which children learn. One is assimilation. Assimilation is modifying the child's environment to so that it fits in to previously developed ways of thinking. All right, so let's take the first time a child is introduced to a banana, right? They look at this big yellow thing, and they don't think of it as a food source necessarily. They might put it in their mouth because they put everything in their mouth, but the outside of a banana tastes crappy, right? So now they have this big yellow object. What do infants do with it next? Well, they usually start banging it, or they'll throw it, or something along those lines, right? So it's very important to note that Piaget said that this was assimilation, right? They take the banana and they start playing with it as if it's a play object rather than using it to bite into, because they don't have that knowledge yet. That's why we call that assimilation, right? Now, the second type of learning that Piaget talks about is accommodation. Accommodation is a totally different type of learning. This is when a child modifies their own self so to fit in with the new environment. Well, what does this mean? This means, let's go back to our banana as an example. Well, now the caregiver opens up the banana and breaks off a little piece and gives it to the infant. And the infant tastes and that's good, sweet, banana, right? Now, when they see that big yellow object, they know that it's actually a food source. So they make a change. They accommodate. They stop thinking about a banana as a play object, and they think about a banana as a food object, and they make accommodations, right? So that's really important, the two different types of learning that Piaget talked about. He also made some very important proposals about cognitive stages of development. Piaget's theory of cognitive development was a little bit like Freud's, except it didn't concentrate on psychosexual development. It concentrated instead on cognitive development, the development of the thought process. So let's quickly talk about some of the stages that Piaget spoke about. First was the sensory motor stage. That lasted from about birth to 2 years. During that stage, the infant would be able to develop object permanence, the idea that even though an object isn't right in front of them, that it still exists in the world. That develops during this stage, so that's very important, right? There's a lot of reflexive patterns in this particular stage, right? The reflexes that we talked about earlier. And the child operates basically in the present. You can't tell them, wait a few hours or wait a couple of weeks and save up your money. That has no meaning to the child in this particular stage. Second stage is probably the most important. It's called the pre-operational stage. Lasts from about 2 to 7 years. During this stage, you have the most rapid language development. Children learn symbolic meaning so they can start to label their world around them. And vocabulary development is very, very important during this stage. There is unsystematic reasoning. It's hard to reason with a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old, right? Not as easy to reason with them. And they do confuse reality and fantasy, right? So cartoons, they think maybe are real. They deal with animism, right? So they think animals can have human traits. And, so when they're watching something, they don't necessarily know if it's real or not. It enables them to believe in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and things along those lines because of that confusion of reality and fantasy. There's also a term called egocentricity. During this stage of the pre-operational stage, children are egocentric. Now, what is egocentricity, right? It doesn't mean that a child disregards somebody else's point of view. It's just that they don't have the ability yet to take another person's point of view. That's very important. They're not blocking the TV, watching the TV, and blocking you from watching it purposely. They just think that if they can see it, you can see it. So everything comes from their point of view. Now, hopefully, people grow out of this stage. It doesn't always happen because we know that people remain egocentric, but for the most part, by age 7, you should progress out of this idea of not being able to give focus to anybody else's point of view. The next stage that Piaget talks about is the concrete operational stage, lasting about age 7 to 12 years. During this stage, you find the development of systematic reasoning, right? There's logical thought, there's reversibility, right? So they can say that if one lump of clay, if you form a lump of clay and then you squish it, you can form it back into that same lump of clay, right? And they comprehend the conservation of mass, right? So if you pour liquid from a container during this stage, if you pour liquid from a narrow, tall container into a shorter, fatter one, and it's the same liquid, now a child knows it's the same amount of liquid even though the container size has changed. Before that, you might not get that comprehension, right? During this stage of concrete operational, the one thing that's missing really is the inability to have abstractions, right? That comes around 12 years of age when children enter what we call the formal operational stage. During the formal operational stage, what you find is that you finally get the ability to reason in the abstract. There's an appreciation of abstract concepts. You can base things on hypotheticals, right? You can say, well, what if you did have this much money? Or what if you were on the moon? How would you move around? So children at that age can now begin to work in the abstract realm. There's also something called evaluation via hypothesis testing, right? So if I have 2 ways of going home from school, I can now say, well, I'm going to try way A and see if that's faster, or try way B and see if that's faster, and then I'm going to stick with the faster way to get home. Well, that's hypothesis testing, and at age 12, the child's brain begins to work like that, right? So that's very important to think about Piaget and the different concepts that he talks about. I wanted to mention one other very important person in terms of the attachment studies we talked about, and that's Harry Harlow. Harlow, in the late 50s, did a study on the attachment of people, of children, to their significant other, right? And he did this study by removing infant monkeys from their mothers immediately after birth. He gave the infant monkeys a choice of 2 surrogate mothers. One of the mother was a cloth mother, right, that was covered in very cuddly things. So even though it wasn't very animated, the infant monkey could hang on to it for comfort. the other mother was the source of, surrogate mother was the source of nourishment. It had a nipple on which the infant monkey could extract food source, but it was chicken wire, so it was very cold and unfeeling, and clinging onto it offered very little comfort to the baby monkey. Well, it turned out that the baby monkey spent almost 90% of the time on the comforting cloth-covered mother. This led us to believe that it's not the feeding act alone that creates the bond between the mother and the infant, right? The strongest part of that bonding is actually the comfort, the emotional calm that the mother, or in this case the surrogate mother, can offer. This term is now called by Harlow contact comfort. And he calls contact comfort the bond that's created between the infant and the caregiver. And he says that it's really the equivalent of love. It's the closest thing we can measure with love. So, this study revealed an important need for contact comfort in infants. Harlow found that when baby monkeys were raised without that proper level of comfort offered, they became skittish, they became self-injurious, they became withdrawn. So they developed abnormally because they didn't get the effects of being reared with a comforting mother or surrogate mother. So that's very important. That's Harry Harlow and his studies. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about before we sign off for this week is play. One of the things Piaget said was that play is the work of children, right? This is how they learn. This is how they pick up concepts. And so developmental psychologists started studying different types of play. And they actually broke it down into many different steps. But for our purposes, I want you to be aware of 3 levels of different types of play and what happens during those times. We know that children do develop and comprehend things through play. For instance, they learn sometimes the rules that are involved and the fact that they can't always take their own sort of point of view, that sometimes they have to take into account others' point of view when they start playing in a group situation, right? So let's talk about 3 different types of play that you should be aware of. One type of play is called solitary play. Now that type of play runs its own course, right? It's independent. They may show a little interest, peek over to a child that's next to them, but basically they're just up in the high chair banging something or throwing blocks or doing whatever they're doing. And solitary play, as it sounds like, solitaire, playing by yourself, is kind of what that is. Next stage of play we want to talk about is parallel play. When children get a little bit older, they past the age of 2, they start to be able to use similar materials. They notice what the child next to them is doing, and they may imitate what the other child is doing. They're showing some interest, but they don't interact during the play period, right? They're parallel play, but they're not interactive play. And then finally, we get to cooperative play. Usually around the age of 3, children start to get involved in more cooperative play, and this involves direct child-to-child play, contact, cooperation. So instead of just building 2 parallel block buildings, they might cooperate and build an even better building. They might play in the sand together and build a sand castle that's even more spectacular than if they were just building it by themselves. So through these different levels of play, you find that children really develop, right? In cooperative play, as I mentioned before, that's the time when you start seeing role playing, you start seeing children playing school, like one takes the role of the teacher, one takes the role of the student, things along those lines. So they start to practice the rules of society through that type of play, and so it becomes very important in their development. So child development is really seen throughout this particular section, right? But it's not just child development. That's what I mean about lifespan. We know that people continue to develop, and that development has expanded throughout the years. Why? Because our lifespan now is a lot longer, right? So it used to be that at the turn of the century that people's life expectancy, if they would live into their maybe 60s, right? And now the life expectancy is close to in the 70s and 80s. So it's been expanded quite a bit. And this is why the development of humans and their personality continues on throughout the lifespan, right? So this is another area that you want to look at, the fact that development continues, and it continues on until late old age. And during that time, you can develop in many different ways in a positive fashion. So if you keep your mind active, if you keep your body active, your development will continue, and you can live a very high quality life into a later age. I encourage everyone to look up Blue Zones on YouTube and look at one of the videos, because they do talk about some of the aspects that lead to a much more enhanced development. They talk about areas in the world where people live to over the age of 100 with a much higher quality lifestyle. So I encourage you to look at that, look at Blue Zones, and take some of the tips that they give you and incorporate them into your life. All right, I'll see you next time we tap into YouTube. Aloha.